All right, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the tuning development notes that happened yesterday as the time of recording this. They were some pretty massive and very, I would say, well-received nerfs to, I guess, like the dungeon pool in general. So I'm going to walk through these changes. I've been able to test a few dungeons since the release of these notes, but I haven't been able to test all of them. But I do want to talk about my thoughts on them in general. I do also want to say that Blizzard has kind of been killing it lately. I think they're very dialed into trying to make sure that Mythic Plus is actually tuned properly. This has been something they've brought up in interviews in recent weeks and recent months, that they understand Mythic Plus has kind of a big problem with, like, high responsibility on tanks and healers, really unnecessarily high group damage, single target abilities, like too many casts. Like, they recognize all this, and I think Blizzard is doing a pretty good job in most dungeons tuning that back. I think there's still some issues in, like, things like the Rookery, for example. But anyways, without rambling on too much with everything that I think is still wrong with Mythic Plus, I want to focus on these notes. So the big one is that health of all creatures has been reduced by 10% in Mythic and Mythic Keystone dungeons. So this is interesting because, first off, I think creatures, I want to say it only affects trash mobs and not bosses, but maybe I'm wrong about that. If I'm wrong, correct me. But basically, they are just making it so mobs die faster, which I think is just good. It makes cooldown classes feel good. They're getting pulls done within their cooldowns. Or if you're like a Ret Paladin, for example, who has very bursty cooldowns, you have a CD for every pack. Moving into the actual dungeon pool, there is a lot to go over, so let's do this. I'm going to try to break it up as well in the timeline below, so if you feel like skipping around, feel free. First, Sacred Flame, Priory of the Sacred Flame. So if you don't know what Blessing of the Internal Flame was, that's A-okay. Basically what this was is that it was an ability, or a kind of a centralized node in the start of the dungeon, as well as up in the cathedral, that gave your group an insane, like, damage buff. For some classes, like In-Hand Shaman, it was dealing like, you were doing like 30% more damage with this buff. Now, it was only accessible by Priest and Paladin players, which is a huge issue. And it had a 40-yard range, and it scaled with keystone level. So the higher key you went, the more important this buff was. Now, what they've done now, okay, so they're saying that it has a 3-second cooldown. I don't know if this means an internal proc cooldown, or if it means that now you can only use it every 3 seconds, which that doesn't matter if that's the case. If it's the former, that'll be better. The problem with this is that, unlike previous dungeons, like from season 1, where you needed like blacksmithing, or you needed herbalism, or like other classes, this one is unique because you can only get it with a priest or a paladin. So this is a huge problem to me. First, they should make it where maybe enchanters can grab the buff, or I guess like maybe like Lightforge Draenei or something can grab the buff as well. But making it only paladin and priest is kind of annoying. This should scale much better. I think this technically almost removes it from play. Like, obviously you can still benefit from it, but it's going to be very, very small compared to what it was previously. So good change. Now they have changed some of the trash. I'm going to skip past this, the boss notes really quick. Devout Priests no longer cast Inner Fire. This is basically just a buff that they would give themselves. It was purgeable, but it was significantly punishing if you like happened to miss a ton of these different casts. They've also replaced some of the priests with footmen, as well as the mages with footmen, which meant that the final chamber of the dungeon has more kind of melee mobs than casters, which I think is a good change. I haven't been in here yet, so I can't say how many of these mobs have been changed. They say a single priest and a single mage, so this might be, I'm assuming it's probably just a single mob in that area, but anyways, this is, again, I'm glad that they're noticing, like, oh, hey, there's too many casters in this area, let's change that. Anyways, the second boss had a visual update to their Sacrificial Pyre. If you don't know what this mechanic is, basically he spawns a random, like, orb on the ground, or I guess like circle, that you have to run into, and when you run into it, it'll knock that player back, and it will it'll like deal group damage to everyone, and it applies a dot to the player who soaked it. So basically you have to rotate 3 players through soaking it to make sure it's cleared. If you don't do that, if you don't soak it fully before it expires, it blows up, dealing pretty much lethal damage. Now, what's also weird about this is that Baron Braunpike, what he does is occasionally he empowers his next ability, and when he empowers the Sacrificial Pyre, instead of 3 soaks, it's 5 soaks. So essentially they're they made a visual update better, or a visual update to the effect to make it more clear. Again, I don't know what this looks like. I'll have to jump in there today at some point, but generally, I think it's a good change. It's going to hopefully make pugging easier. In pre-made groups, obviously, you're going to be in comms, or you'll have some type of order set to this. We also have the last boss, Priory Merprey. They've reduced the failure effect of blinding light by 95%. Now, this is a funny mechanic because it's been a while since we've had to look away from a boss when a mechanic goes off. I can't think of I feel like there was a boss in Shadowlands that did that, but basically, you look away and nothing happens. If you don't look away, you basically get one shot, and if you don't get one shot, you're getting clapped and you're getting blinded for like 4 seconds or something. So them reducing, I'm assuming it's reducing the damage, not the actual blind effect, which is fine, I guess. I'm assuming. Also in phase 2, the melee damage from the ads are reduced. What's annoying about these ads is that they can't be tanked. They fixate players like DPS and healers. So ideally what you do is you CC them until they die. They have like an effect on them that just drains their health over time and eventually they perish. So things like Ring of Peace, any kind of like AoE stun, Mass Root, things like that are going to be really effective in this dungeon. And then lastly, there was this weird thing. If you phased her too quickly, her inner fire would apply when she's doing Embrace the Light, which is her intermission damage, which would cause her to like basically just kill your group. So it was more or less a bug fix. I don't think it's a bug. I just think like it was poor timing on that part. So they made it so it cancels the inner fire. It's just a cancel aura. It's good. Priory looking like a pretty good dungeon this next season, as long as this buff isn't too overpowered. Moving on, the Rookery. First boss's health reduced. This is good. They've made some really good changes to this fight, but he felt so tanky, especially if he started losing DPS to just like random bleed out. So good change. And then the next change comes at the very end of the dungeon. So the Stormrider's Vengeance was the extra action button you were able to get while clearing the trash downstairs. It allowed you to stun mobs for a very long period of time. This was really good in coordinated groups, but again, if your players didn't realize that they had the extra action button or never used it, it made the trash really difficult. So I think just removing it is better than keeping it in, but the trash in the back half of the dungeon is fairly lethal, so maybe they need to nerf some of that trash, but we'll have to see. Now, the Voidstorm Monstrosity final boss, these are massive improvements. I'm going to be doing boss guides on these in the near future, so if you don't understand all of these lines of text, don't worry about it. But basically, the boss would spawn these void fragments from his null upheaval. It was 4, it's been reduced to 3. And the problem with this is it would knock you back, spawn a bunch of swirls, spawn these shards, and then you had to get near the void fragments to break them, because if they didn't break, they would spawn ads that would essentially, you would die. You wipe if any of these go off. So having 4 of them meant that everyone that wasn't your tank had to individually get to one, and the distance that they could spawn from you was crazy. So what they've done is they've kind of fixed the where they spawn at. They've also reduced the boss's health, I'm assuming, or maybe this is the ad health, in case you miss it. And they made it so you have more movement speed after you get hit with null upheaval. Basically, you get hit with null upheaval, but then you get Stormrider's Charge, which increases your movement speed. So basically, they've made it easier to actually counter this mechanic, which, again, it was very difficult. Even in a full coordinated group, we were struggling at getting all 4 of the void fragments done. It took us like 4 or 5 attempts to kill the boss. Anyways, moving on, Cinderbrew Meadery. They removed a patrol of hired thugs, or hired muscles. These guys fucking slapped, so this being removed is very good. Also, depending on your DPS and depending on how you pulled the room, these hired muscles would patrol into you at a very inopportune time and pretty much cause you to wipe. They also made the first boss a little bit better, similar to Dread Captain Lockwood in the Siege of Borealis. They made it now percentage based instead of 100 energy based, which is very good. While he's in intermission, he's immune to damage. So if you didn't have high boss damage, you'd have to do intermission 3, 4, 5 times in some of the worst cases, and the boss fight would take like forever. So having this being a little bit more controlled is actually pretty good. It allows you to save a healing cooldown if you really need to. It allows you to kind of plan your movement a little bit better. It allows you to bank cooldown, so when you get out of the phase, you can blast the boss. All very good changes. And then lastly, they made Bank Busby has a slightly quality of life change to the honey marinade. It now grows over 4 seconds instead of instantly spawning. This is a little bit better for tanks, and they made the bees kind of easier to kill. In high content like 12s and 12s up, this was kind of annoying because it felt more like you had to use CDs on ads instead of using CDs on boss. having the reduced health means you can just kind of cleave them down naturally and not have to worry about it as much. Darkflame Cleft has a lot of changes going on, and they're all changes to the bosses. Now, funnily enough, I was going to do a boss video talking about how much I hate all of, not all of the bosses, but the majority of the bosses this upcoming season. And they keep releasing notes like this, and I had to actually postpone and pretty much scrap the video entirely because the changes that they're making ends up actually being pretty good. But anyways, they have reduced the minecart's health on the first boss. They've also made it summon less labors, and the Reckless Charge deals significantly less damage. The problem I had with this fight is that it felt very chaotic for DPS, and there was nothing technically to tank. The boss frontal is all physical, or boss, not even a frontal, the boss hit is all physical, so it's mitigated basically by base mitigation. You can obviously play it safe with big cooldowns, but all the damage came from like Reckless Charge on DPS, fixating ads on DPS, as well as the minecart potentially going off and wiping your group. So they fixed this fight a little bit more. I'm a fan of these changes. They didn't do anything to the second boss, which is fine. The second boss thematically, and I think it plays really well for the whole group. Again, it's not a great tank fight, but that doesn't matter. The Candle King, though, is the third boss, and they've reduced his Eerie Mold damage, which is basically he spawns statues of every player. So there's 5 statues get spawned. For every statue that's active, it does damage. So when there's 5 statues, let's say it's doing 100 damage each, you're taking 500 damage per second. So you want to basically remove the molds as often as you can. Now, how do you do that? Now, beforehand, if it touched a player, it would despawn. So things like DK with AMS, Rogue with Cloak of Shadows, DK also with Icebound Fortitude, especially with their tier set proc on BDK, Paladins with Bubble. Basically, any class that can stun immune was able to run into the statue and then remove the stun, and it would get rid of the statue entirely. So some classes were able to basically cheese the fight, making it a single target training dummy, essentially. So they changed it so they no longer despawn. But in turn, they also nerfed the damage of the periodic damage. So now Cursed Wax stun duration has also been reduced by 75%. So if you run into it, it'll still stun you, but instead of like 8 seconds, it's now going to be like 2 seconds or whatever the duration is. And the Throw Dark Flame is also reduced, and it now targets 3 players. So basically there's a circle around players and they want to stand near the statues to destroy them. When there was only 2, it was really difficult to hit all of the statues. So if you didn't have a class that could immune, you were going to be in trouble later on in the fight. So this is all good. Now they did change the minecart event. The minecart event isn't part of the Candle King. It's part of it. It's its own thing between Candle King and the Darkness, the last 2 bosses. Basically, they over double the amount of candles you have to utilize, and they increase the base speed. So hopefully by at this point, it's probably not a horrible minigame to play. There is a strategy to this that I'll go over in a future like short or video that trivializes this, and I'll talk about that there. Last but not least, we have the Darkness. First things first, Darkness no longer covers the boss area before pulling, which is really nice because if you were dumb like me, you would pull a bunch of trash and then accidentally walk too close to the boss where you were doing 99% reduced damage and healing. So them removing this is kind of nice. And then on the actual boss, they've increased the radius baseline. They've decreased the rate at it, how it reduces, I guess, or increased the rate it reduces. No. Yeah, I said that right the first time. They've also increased the minimum light radius, which is nice, which means you kind of always have a little bit of light to utilize. And they've reduced basically the enemy count. So all good changes, very good. Moving on to Workshop. Workshop, we have Bomb Tonk health being reduced. Barrage now targets 1 player instead of 2. So basically this is the trash at the very beginning. Bomb Tonks are really scary because you need multiple kicks to kick detonate. Pretty much 1 melee kick per ad. If you had like a full range comp, this could get scary if you kept chain pulling. The Tonk Barrage was just like, it was so much to dodge. Like range, like casters really couldn't do damage on these pulls because of how often the Rocket Barrage would actually go off. So this is good. The Tussle Tonks now have increased movement speed. And this might sound like they're buffing it, but honestly, this is a really good change because it's now actually easy to move the bosses around and keep them stacked up after like things like Foe Flipper or Ground Pound or whatever mechanic is going on. There's a lot on this fight, though. I wish they would remove a mechanic. They did change it, so the boss can now channel wall, or move wall channel and ground pound, which makes it a little bit easier for tanks to actually snipe this cast by hitting it with a hammer. And then you also have the radius being reduced to 6 yards. The most annoying part about this was previously, as a tank, your melee had to run out of the boss's like range every like 10 seconds because this tank buster happens so often, and them reducing the radius of this the tank buster means that melee can actually hit the boss. So good change. They've reduced sticky sludge, that's fine. Cujo, venting flames has been reduced to 3 seconds, and explosive leap always targets 3 players. So basically how the fight used to work was venting flames would happen for 5 seconds, which was kind of obnoxious because you had to like line of sight behind the box, which meant that you were spending 5 to 7 seconds not hitting the boss because you'd obviously have to move behind before the channel actually starts, and then you'd want to wait till the last tick before getting into a position where you can see the boss and start casting again. This also kind of nerfs the line of sight tech you would use though on the box. Like really good tanks could position the boss where they could stand behind, but melee could still actually hit the boss. Very finicky. I will also do some type of guide talking about how to do it. It's still doable, but it's less important now because the channel only lasts for 3 seconds instead of 5. So that's good. The explosive leap also used to ramp up. It used to go 2, 3, 4. Now it's always 3, 3, 3, 3 forever. You can still, you can technically feign and invis, and you can do this by baiting it on the furthest player first, and they would like meld or feign or invis or vanish when the boss is mid-air in their leap. You don't want to do it too early, and you don't want to do it too late. But anyways, good change. The improved visuals are very good. The Sonic Pulse, there's now like a very hard line. It looks so good. If you get hit by this, you are very bad. It's very easy to see now. They've also reduced the overclock haste, which is, again, fine. And they've also reduced the Arcing Zap's initial cool up. So that's good too. And then Machinist Garden, he has his health reduced, which just means the fight should die quicker before it gets too out of hand. Overall, very good changes. We have a few more to get through. Let's talk about the Motherlode. Now, this is the first dungeon we're seeing a massive time reduced in. This actually makes sense. I've seen a ton of plus 12s or plus 14s from PTR that people are doing this dungeon in like 25 minutes. I've ran this dungeon in like 20 minutes already on like a plus 10. It's not the way that they change the trash in this dungeon and the bosses make it so this dungeon is very lenient. So again, it's not a 40-minute dungeon anymore. It's now closer to a 30-minute dungeon, and it feels much better. Mastermind's Mind Lash is now a single target ability instead of multiple random players. That's fine, as long as the tuning on this isn't too crazy. Propellant Blast now will clear more of the room since it targets a third player. This will also slow down the pace of the fight. This fight is basically a target dummy at this point, in my opinion. I don't like Grixis Flux Flame, mostly because it's just really boring. They made some Crawler Mine changes, and then lastly, Mogul Razdunk will now tell the player who's being targeted by homing missile before the homing missile goes out. This was very annoying, especially at the very start of the fight, but it's fine. Like, this is a fine change. Theater of Pain has also had a reduced timer. We're not really seeing anywhere to make this percentage up at, so hopefully they do some further tuning. I guess that tuning is coming from the 10% health nerf that we're seeing across the board. Decia now has an increased melee speed, or I guess decreased melee speed. Yeah. Now melee's every 3 seconds instead of every 1.5. Mortal Strike has been cut in half from 10 seconds to 5 seconds. And it has a reduction increase from 30 to 50. So instead of 30% for 10 seconds is now 50% for 5 seconds by 50%. There we go. English is hard. So this is all good. And then Mighty Smash, there's a little bit more time to prepare for it. Instead of 2.5, it's now 4 seconds. That's good. Packaran. His melee damage has been reduced and he no longer casts. This is all, like, this guy is just, this is the last target always. You never target Packaran anymore. Obviously cleave him, but never focus Packaran down. His Noxious Spores now grow every 3 instead of every 2, or every 3 instead of every 2 in terms of targeting, and the travel time has been significantly increased. This was causing a lot of issues for a lot of the groups I run with on PTR. People were getting clapped by this ability. Sathel has been buffed, though, in some ways. I guess it only targets 2 players instead of 5, but they've increased Searing Death duration, so I'm assuming this is going to do more damage. Unless it does the same damage over 12 seconds, then it technically is a nerf. All very good changes. Not that this fight was hard, but there was a very specific overlap when Sathel would cast his abilities plus the Mighty Smash, and the tank would have Mortal Strike on him, which that was very brutal for your healer and for your group as a whole. Kolthrak had some adjustments to his ability pacing, which, in my opinion, wasn't too difficult, but still fine. I haven't tested this dungeon personally yet since these changes, so I'm not really sure. Will of Darkness has been reduced to only 6 seconds. And Death Spiral actually had a movement speed reduction, meaning that it should be easier for casters to actually do damage on this fight. Last but not least, we have Operation Floodgates. Big Mama has seen a damage reduce on the Kilo barrier. This is basically a pseudo enrage when the boss is alive, or the ads are alive too long. It basically, if the ads are alive for more than a minute, he gains a shield and just starts pulsing damage, and it's really bad. Also, they nerfed the Tank Buster. Swampface had a reduction to how much the pairing does. So basically on this fight, you get paired to another player, and that was a permanent dot that would fade eventually because it would repair you with someone else. But basically, they reduced that damage, but they increased the danger of awakening the swamp, which is fine. Like, I think this is a good change. The Razor Vines, having it reduced, this lasts a lot longer than Awaken the Swamp, and now Awaken the Swamp is the thing that the healer wants to ramp for. They're reducing some of the sniper damage, and they're nerfing the fish. So Bubbles is the fish you fight right after killing Swampface, and he was beyond lethal. He applies 3 stacks of a dot, and that dot at 3 stacks would last for 10 seconds, and it would pretty much kill anyone who didn't have a defensive up. But yeah, very good changes here. I'm going to be testing a lot throughout this week. Now, I am still in the midst of attempting to push for title on my Brewmaster on live, so I am going to be kind of juggling these two things. Let me know what you guys think of these changes below. I think they're all really good. Again, I still have to test some of them, but we're looking good for Season 2, and I'm getting pretty excited. It's now only a week and a half away. Obviously, the season is delayed a further week, but still. Anyways, thanks so much for watching, and I will catch you all in the next one. Peace.